All right, guys, this is Shelter back with another video. I know I'm a little bit late to this one because a week ago, approximately, the Turtle team decided on what changes they wanted to do to the PvP scene. So in this video, we're going to be reading through the changes that they are going to implement in the next patch 1.18.1. If you guys don't know, I've made a video where they were discussing what changes they wanted to implement to WoW's PvP scene to tone down the burstiness, and they were talking about adding resilience. And I was urging them in my video to not do that. I think it separates the communities, and I think it brings along with it, like it strips gear freedom from people and a host of other issues. In my personal opinion, you can check out that video if you want to understand exactly why I dislike PvP specific stats like resilience. But it seems like they've not gone that route. So, and I'm happy to see that. So let's just take a look at what they've decided to do. So they say, greetings. Not long ago, we asked your thoughts on potential PvP changes. First off, we'd like to thank everyone who has taken the time to write constructive feedback and input. Drawing on your suggestions and our own internal discussions, we're ready to share what's coming next. PvP updates will arrive in two stages, the 1.18 and 1.18.1. So, first off, beginning with patch 1.18, every player who enters a battleground or arena will automatically receive a universal buff/debuff that 1 reduces incoming physical damage by X, reduces incoming magical damage by X, reduces incoming healing by X, and reduce incoming shields. I'm not sure I understand what this means. Maybe they're talking about priest shields and mage shields and stuff like that absorb shields that absorb damage, but I could be wrong. But anyway, that's first part of this, and this was what they did, I think, in Season of Discovery as well, and it's so easy for them to implement something like this and scale it up and down until they find the sweet spot where it's not too bursty, but it doesn't remove burst completely. You know, you still want a let's say a Huntsman Shaman to make a dent into someone's health when they get a Windfury proc, but might necessarily not want them to be one shot at that point. So I think, and then with this system here, when they separate physical damage and magical damage, is good in many ways, because then they can tune each different type of damage, and mainly because, of course, magical damage goes through armor, so any amount of armor doesn't really help you. The only thing that I dislike about this is, of course, that it's only in battlegrounds and arena. So I would love to see this implemented into world PvP as well. But I can see that it might be difficult to implement something out of instance zones. While within an instance zone where you can control all variables, that's where it's a lot easier to just implement a buff/debuff to change some values. This was one of the options that I was talking about, reducing damage in PvP, and they've gone a little bit further, also reducing healing, which a lot of people in my video they brought up, because if you reduce damage, then healing becomes overpowered, and that's where I suggest increasing health instead, because then you're nerfing healing in the same way. If you just increase the health pool of people, then they will require more healing to get to full health, and that's gonna tax the healers a little bit more. So that's another way of indirectly nerfing healing, is increasing health. But something like this is also perfectly fine, separating these and reducing each to what they need. Please note that the above percentages only have placeholder values, and they don't have any values. The actual values will be made public and definitive once we get closer to the patch release. And that's probably something that's going to change over time, because this will require a lot of fine-tuning. And then just to make sure that people understand me, I'm not against PvP. I'm not against resilience per se. I'm against separating gear, like having to grind 2 sets of gear, one for your PvE and one for your PvP. And I think that feels bad. So some people also in my previous video suggesting that, well, why not just put resilience on all gear? And that's also a perfectly fine option, a perfectly fine thing to do. My point is that you should be able to use PvP gear in PvE and PvE gear in PvP. So that's pretty much my stance. But moving on, patch 1.18 will also add new arena map. Awesome. Add the return of 2v2 arenas. I didn't know that was gone. Actually, I haven't played much arena lately. I'm still trying to gear my characters in dungeons and raids. Add rated arena teams. Okay, so now you actually can make your arena team with a dedicated roster. So that's gonna be interesting. Introduce a stacking debuff to anyone holding the flag for an intended period of time in Warsong Gulch. So just to make sure that these fights don't get too drawn out. I think especially Warsong Gulch is prone to having a really long fights when there's no timer or there's no battleground timer. So these are just 2 options to accelerate the time at which it takes to complete this battleground. Players who are standing in spots that we deem safe spots, as described by our rules, will now receive a damage over time debuff that will last as long as they are in such position. These positions will be continuously updated by the team. Pretty sure that most of this is directed towards something like Warsong Gulch. Carrying the flag, being the flag carrier and trying to stay safe spot with the flag is, I can see why they want to make some changes to that. So that's fine with me. At patch 1.18.1, the follow-up patch focuses on broadening PvP appeal. They will rework rewards and gear progression so that PvP will be a truly viable gearing path. Partly reworking the current honor system to reduce the brutal race against the clock at high PvP ranks, and several open world PvP events. That's really, really cool. This is what I'd love to see more of in the game. And then also a brand new battleground. And maybe they're gonna rework Sonic Glade, because I don't think I've ever been in that battleground, because nobody's really signing up for it, and that's gotta be because the battleground is bad or something. Even when there is the weekly event where you sign up to a specific battleground and you get more rewards from that battleground, even then nobody's signing up for it. So maybe they'll remove it and do something completely different, or they'll rework this battleground. And why the universal debuff instead of PvP stats? So now they go into a little bit more depth on why they took this approach. When looking at what could be done to extend PvP battles and combat and reduce some of the volatile burst that exists now, we've opted to go for a more general debuff rather than having PvP specific gear that does the same through set bonuses or adding on more of a resilience-like stat. Our main reason for this is that once we start reworking the gear progression for PvP, we want to make sure we can stat this new gear somewhat similarly to the current PvE gear tiers, with a few more minor benefits to PvP. This avoids forcefully splitting up 2 communities based on the gameplay they prefer. And this is exactly what I was on about. Once you split the communities and say to people, well, you gotta choose, do you want to be a PvPer or do you want to be a PvEer? This is what hurts the casual players the most, because most people, and me included, I want to be a PvPer, but I also want to be a PvEer. I want to go into dungeons and raids and stuff, but I'm not going to be farming 2 different sets of gear. I'm just not. I don't have time for that. So I think making sure that you can use both sets of gear in different avenues or aspects of the game is the best approach. And interesting that they're going to follow the tiers. So tier 1, they'll have a tier 1 PvP gear. Tier 2, then you have tier 2 PvP gear, and so on and so forth. And how they'll be doing that's going to be interesting to see, if they are introducing some arena specific stats to achieve the higher tiers of PvP gear. We'll just have to see. I don't know how I feel about that, but I'm not, basically I'm not sure if it's a good idea or a bad idea. It could be a fine thing to do. Next, they say we feel that if a player who has geared mainly through PvP progression wants to dabble in PvE raiding, they should be able to with the gear they achieved in PvP without starting back at zero with stats that are mainly useless and vice versa. That's exactly my point in the video that I made. So I'm really happy and glad to see that they did not go with PvP specific stats. I talked a little bit with Mythics about some of this. He's not sure, but I think he's not really overly fond of this debuff. I think he thinks that it's a band-aid fix, which it kind of is. But in my opinion, it's better than resilience and separating communities. The best thing would probably be to reduce like base values, but that's really difficult because even if you reduce gear creep, you still want people incentivized to do, Cursan beyond just different, what's it called, set bonuses. They actually probably, for it to be progressed, would like to see some tangible upgrades. That's one thing. So some gear creep will always be present. They could reduce that for sure, but then you stump into the next issue, which is the talent changes and overall abilities and class changes that they've made to each class, just to make sure that they are viable in PvE with each spec. That's gonna bring up the damage numbers. So I think just to make sure the talents are still interesting and not too weak, some of these the damage values will inevitably go up, I think, and it's a lot harder for the team to go back and reduce values and all of those things than it is to implement a buff like this, just to test it out, see how people think about it. Maybe in the future they'll be revisiting something like this and make a more not so much of a band-aid fix, but a more thorough fix, if you could say. Let's see what people say. They say, based. That's some good news. Keep up the good work. Would the team consider giving all world bosses an aura that gives every player within X yards a debuff that immediately flags them for PvP and enables cross-faction PvP? That could be an idea for a PvP-based boss in the world. So with these nerfs, undergeared players become a non-threat because they're already low DPS and burst is even lower. He has a good point now, and that's also actually what now that I talk about as I remember it, that's also what I talked about Mythics, what me and him we talked about, which was once you implement such a buff, then the lower geared people, they're gonna do even less damage. So if you wanted to bring up the people with the bad gear and reduce the damage of the people with the higher gear, how would you implement something like that? I don't really see a solution to that one. So there's still going to be a big discrepancy between a highly geared person and a less geared person. And then you say, okay, but make it based on item level. But then people would probably try to go around that system. People would equip low item level gear before entering or signing up for a battleground, and once they get in the battleground, they maybe swap out pieces. So I think it's really difficult to try to completely even the playing field once this much power creep has been introduced into the game. Once we are at Naxxramas, you're going to have to gear your character a little bit if you want to compete. I still think that with this system, with what they implemented, with reducing the damage, more skill comes into play. Like, skill becomes more relevant when people don't get one-shotted straight away. And he goes on to say that it also indirectly nerfs classes that rely on RNG burst, while buffing classes that have core strength of endurance, i.e. outlasting classes, will be hugely buffed. He's not wrong about that. And that's why they need to tune this the right way. They shouldn't remove burst. They should make sure that it's still like an enhancement shaman is still a viable build, but you still need to, you're still gonna have to force people to use more than one ability to kill someone. And outlasting might not be so hugely buffed, especially when we're talking about healer classes and classes who shield themselves, because the healing is also going to be reduced and the absorptions are also going to be reduced. So it seems like they've thought about, at least to a degree, thought about this comment here. Some people come and cry about they can't kill X. Gear changes are solid though. Looking forward to that. Maybe, and then that's the nice thing about such a system that they've implemented. They can always adjust the numbers again. So it's easy for them to implement and it's easy to remove. While something like resilience is probably a lot harder because you need to implement the right amount on each gear, and then to adjust those values, adjust all that gear takes a lot of development time. This is a lot easier for them to just test out what will work. And he says this exact same here. That's why those values should vary depending on the player gear score to a certain degree. Well, depending on the player gear score, that's the thing, people can abuse that. So that's probably a really difficult thing to do. And then now we're talking about gear creep again, or power creep again. There's a huge difference between someone who just dinked 60 and someone who's running around in full next gear. And if they continue to push out newer raids with better and better gear, then that discrepancy or that difference is going to be bigger and bigger, while people staying in the same bracket battlegrounds. But you have to differentiate with something else than gear, I think, because differentiating just with gear could probably be abused with people just removing their gear before they enter the battleground or sign up and then putting it on while in the battleground. Then you'll have to maybe have a system that keeps checking people's gear, and I think that's going to be really difficult for the developers to develop something like that. So I really, realistically, I don't think this is going to be a thing. They're going to adjust it by percentages, and it's going to hurt the low level players, of course, but on an equal basis. So basically it's going to be the same as it's always been, just with less burst, and hopefully also with less of ability to outlast your enemies, so that the warlocks and the priests and people who can sustain themselves don't get too overly buffed. So I think that's great. That's why they do it like this, with the separating not just damage but magical healing and shield or absorbs. As Half-Greek stated, a BG only dampening is a bad idea. It was tested in Season of Discovery and it created more problems than it solved. FOTM class become even more FOTM. Low-geared players are unable to compete in any way. Currently, with some skill, they can pull something off. Mana becomes a bigger problem. Casters are going too before they can kill someone that has flagged themselves. Some specs will become unplayable. Dot specs will become more prevalent, as now they are the most efficient specs. Affliction. Melee will become brutally oppressive to casters with no mobility that relied on quick setups to win, something that has become even harder to pull off with the PvP trinket changes. Segregating world PvP damage and BG damage will split PvP population. More people will feel inclined to sit in open world to completely delete players instead of doing BGs if they feel they got too weak inside battlegrounds. Well, that's why they need to not bring these values up too high. But I'm not sure I fully agree with him on this. I don't think it really makes that big of a difference, especially if they also account for stuff like healing and absorbs. But it is a balancing act, and it is something that needs constant adjusting to make sure that it still feels good and feels fun to PvP, and some specs won't become too oppressive. This will only be okay if it's a temporary measure until PvP gear is introduced. I'm not sure I really see what the difference between this and PvP gear is. This is just for everyone, even people without PvP gear. How are you justifying all of this and then saying, but once PvP gear gets implemented, then this issue isn't there anymore? How does this issue disappear with PvP gear? I'm really not sure. So now people with PvP gear will just be the ones who are overpowered and strong in PvP, and no one else will be able to compete against those. I'd strongly advise to work on PvP gear instead and not introduce BG dampening. With different damage/healing numbers, you might as well introduce resilience with the added benefit of balancing out world PvP as well. So somehow all of these changes that they made, the dampening, that's bad, but PvP gear is good because it doesn't introduce dampening, but it does. I don't really get this comment. And as for gearing segregation, you have already started this trend somewhat with Kara gear, where some pieces are unusable in PvP due to lack of stamina. Well, that's just it. Stamina is a great PvP stat, but it's not. It's not the only stat that works in PvP. Different stats also work in PvP. And you could go for a glass cannon build in PvP. You could also go stamina heavy, but it's not going to make such a huge difference. And these stats are still valuable in PvE. Stamina is still valuable in PvE, which resilience is not. I'm fine with something like resilience, but then bring it over to PvE as well, so that if I gear for resilience, I'm not gimping myself in PvE. Mainly, I just don't want to farm 2 different sets of gear. And also, because if I had to choose, I'd be a PvPer. I'd just go for PvP. If you forced me to choose, I'd stop raiding completely and stop enjoying PvE. I'd find it boring and I'd burn out of the game a lot faster, but I would mainly stick to PvP. And then I would also feel that it's quite boring because there's no freedom anymore. I can't assemble my own set of gear. I'd go through a checklist, which is the PvP gear. What do I go? Which item do I get next? The one on the list. Okay, there's not much interest in that. While when you mix the two, then I can mix PvE gear and PvP gear, and it's still fine. But once you introduce PvP specific stats, then I want all my items to have this PvP specific stats, because that's going to be the best in PvP. So I hope you understand where I'm coming from with this. PvP should be about skill, not gear. But well, PvE people can't understand that. I agree, PvP should be mostly about skill, but we are playing an RPG. If you just wanted to play a game where gear doesn't matter, well, then you have games like Overwatch and Counter-Strike, and there are tons of games that you can even go play Chivalry and Mordhau. Those are medieval games where you kill people with an axes and spears, and gear doesn't matter. It's purely about skill. But we are playing an MMORPG with the name RPG in it, so we want gear to also matter. That should also be a way for a bad player to compete with a good player. A bad player who doesn't understand his class to the same extent as a good PvP player does, he should be able to compete with just having better gear, because that was the way he chose to play the game. So I don't see this is some of the great things about MMORPGs, especially World of Warcraft, that embraces that idea that, well, you might be shit at your class, but you could outgear your enemies, or you might have shitty gear, but you could be like Verdne and outskill your enemies. And I like that idea. If I wanted only to be skill, the game only to be about skill, I'd play a game like Chivalry or Counter-Strike or Dota for that matter. Well, Dota still has gear in it. But yeah, maybe you could do a battleground where gear doesn't matter. If it's confined to a battleground, say for instance a battle royale style of battleground, where you jump in and you collect gear that's capped to a specific item level, and then in that way you can keep power creep in check. Or you could just make a battleground or arena match where you fight with the template set of stats. so your gear doesn't matter at all. Something like that, but only confined to a specific battleground or confined to a specific arena match, could probably be fun and also quite interesting. In that way, the outcome of the game would only be determined by your skill. But the thing is, we just want freedom, right? That's where I'm coming from, at least. And I think that's where most people who dislike resilience and PvP specific stats, which I think most vanilla players do, they don't want something like resilience. I think flying mounts and resilience are some of the two worst things that TBC brought along with it. TBC was great in many ways. Great class changes and all that stuff. Great PvE and really fun PvP. The only problem was PvP specific stats and flying mounts. And once you go through the surveys on the internet, that's also what most people, they dislike and don't want Vanilla Plus to be something with either resilience or flying mounts. So yeah, I think that's it for this one. I'm not going to go through all of the comments here, but I'll leave a link in the description to this site, and then people can go check it out on their own. But I'm hyped for this. I'm really glad to see that they went with this change instead of resilience. So for me, I think this is a great idea. And again, if you want to check out my video, want to see my in-depth reasoning as to why I think resilience and PvP specific stats are a bad idea, I'll link the video. I've made a video about that. I'll link it in the description. It's a short 10-minute video where I go over the cons of resilience, and I'll maybe also put it on screen here at the end. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you liked the video, and I'll see you in the next one.